Hello, welcome back to Math Time with Professor Prime, and I'm your host as always, Professor Prime. So, today we're going to talk about math in Final Fantasy 15. And here's how it's going to go. I'm going to talk about Final Fantasy 15, its history a little bit, its gameplay, and more elements as well, and how math is used in all those things. And I'll be also talking about my experience with the game and how I felt about it. So let's get into it with the idea being there can be spoilers. You should assume all the spoilers if you want to be extra safe, but I will try to avoid them. But I make no promises, so keep that in mind. Okay, so let's get started. So, Final Fantasy 15. That 15 right there, right? That's some math to begin with. But seriously, though, right? Like, with that 15, it in context does tell you something. It's the 15th main entry into the Final Fantasy franchise. And that gives you an idea of what you can kind of expect from that game. You can expect that even though the combat system will be different than some previous games because they're different in each of those games, you can expect some commonalities, right? You can expect that there will be stats like attack, defense, magic, vitality, strength, spirit, and all of that, right? HP, all that sort of stuff. You can expect leveling up. You can expect magic, which I mentioned is part of the stats, is part of the gameplay, in addition to the melee side of things. You can expect summons. You can expect that there's going to be a big bad. You can expect that the heroes will either be connected like previously or they'll form a strong bond during the journey. You can expect a fair amount of nihilism throughout the game, and you can expect some drama. You can expect action videos, and you can absolutely expect brilliance music. And you know, you can expect all these things and more. When you see Final Fantasy and you see that number behind it, that indicates something. So that's pretty cool to me, and that's a little math for the start. We use numbers for a lot of things. With in and of themselves, they don't mean anything. But what they represent, that absolutely does. For example, like 5, you know what 5 is. And whether I'm calling it 5 or showing you 5 like I did here, or like if I refer to 5 in another language, or I draw you 5 dots. If you know what 5 is going to be, you know what it represents, what it's called, that's irrelevant. How we display it, it depends on the context, right? But we're going to want to get something across. And it's the same thing with the numbering in Final Fantasy. And I think it's also interesting that there are a few titles that actually have numbers in addition to that number, right? Because like take 10, for instance. You have 10, sure, but you also have 10-2. And it's a little tricky into that too, because like occasionally you will like get other titles in the main line that have sequels like 10 did. But they won't necessarily be called that, right? Because you get like Final Fantasy 7, and then you get Dirge of Cerberus as a follow up to that, and arguably Final Fantasy Remake, but that's a whole other story for another day. Because there's so much to say about that, and I've talked about that in the past. But so that's my main thing with the numbers. But to carry on, when you get to the actual gameplay, like some of the things that I mentioned that show up require math, right? Because the stats, for instance, that's one way to start that conversation or continue it rather. Okay, so you have the idea of stats. You have attack, you have defense, you have strength, you have magic, you have you have vitality, and you have spirit. And with all of that, it's dictating, you know, how you're dishing out the damage and how you're taking it to various degrees. Your HP also dictates like where you're at damage wise, with the idea being you don't want to be at 0. But so there's really like some outward stats that are kept track numerically, and there's some things that are behind the scenes that also further what you're doing in terms of dishing out damage versus taking it. And there's also the idea that you can equip gear. There's also the idea that you can get buffs. And in Final Fantasy 15, there are like, if I'm not mistaken, around 80 different buffs. I kid you not. like, and that's insane to me. And these buffs can do anything from like, raise your attack and defense to make you immune to different status um, ailments. And that's the thing too, right? You have the idea of your status. You can have different statuses, and some of those statuses take the form of like those buffs, but some of them are like debuffs. And you can get some of the standard ones like confusion and poison, but there's a whole bunch of other ones that come in this game. And the idea is like there's math going on with your stats, math going on with your status or your status, math going on with the weapons that you choose, um, math going on with your gear, and to your weapons. Like the main character that you're playing as is Noctis. You have Prompto, Ignis, and Gladio too, but the one that you primarily are controlling is Noctis, and Noctis can wield several different arms. These range from swords to great swords to guns, to daggers, and just so many different things in between that. And whereas his companions, they can wield a specific type of weapons, and no matter how you cut it, different weapons have different effects. Some of them are status, some of them are elements, and some are status related, some of them are elemental in nature, and different weapons come with different attributes, right? Because you might have a weapon like a great sword that's going to do more damage than a weapon like a sword, like a regular sword. And you might have a weapon like the daggers that do less damage than a sword, but they're faster, right? So you got to consider that sort of thing. And something like guns or a range attack. You might be doing less damage on them too, with those two, depending on the guns that you have, but you have that idea of increased range that you can take advantage of, right? You have that distance, right? That's mathematical in nature too. And not only are these weapons different from each other, but you can accrue different weapons over the games that will make you more powerful. And like back to the stats, these stats increase with your gear, like I mentioned, and your weapons help with certain stats. And you know what else helps? How you progress in the game in terms of what you're doing. That comes in the form of experience. There was a better, more eloquent way to say it, but my whole thing is like, right, is you're going through the game. Part of how you navigate that is by getting into battles, by going on hunts, by doing all sorts of like different quests and side quests. And the idea with that is you go on, they build up two things that both help you progress further in the story and overcome challenges. One of those things is experience. You gain more experiences. Sorry, you gain more experience points you gain experience points when you win battles. You gain more experience points when you go on those quests and side quests, and you go on hunts and things along those lines. And as you build experience points, you can level up, right? So this is the one thing that helps you navigate throughout the game, right? Getting higher levels. And so with that leveling up, there's a caveat to it that isn't in most Final Fantasy games. You don't just automatically level up. You can accrue those experience points, sure, and that's great. But you are going to have to either set up camp or you're going to have to go to an inn. When you set up camp, your experience shoots up and it allows you to level up, right? All the experience that you accrue to that point. And when you're camping, it allows you to eat certain meals. And when you eat certain meals, each of those meals comes with buffs. And this can be increasing your HP, increasing the amount of experience that you can get, like your experience rate. It could be things like that. It could be making you poison proof. You name it. There's a lot of options. And one of the other things that you could do is you could go to an inn. This will cost you money. And there's math in that money. And the idea is like it can cost you money, but it can give you more experience. Like you might get like 1.5 times the amount of experience if you stay the night at an inn, or 2 times the amount of experience, or 3, whatever the case may be. And so that's the trade-off. And you also can't use so you also can't eat meals. So it's like, well, you got to decide what you want to do. You want to make sure that you're leveling up, because if you're not leveling up, your stats are not automatically increasing. That doesn't happen until you level up. And so you got to decide what you want to do in those cases. Do you go to a camp where you don't have to pay and you can get a meal that will give you a buff? Or do you go to an inn where you do have to pay, you can't get those extra buffs, but you will get more experience? You got to decide. And as you get those experience points and they accumulate, you level up. Your stats increase, you're able to do more things. And here's another way that you can navigate the game. AP, ability points. And you can get those in numerous ways. But as you're keeping track of that, right? Like you're leveling up, you're going and you're doing your missions, you're building up AP along the way as well. You can spend your ability points on new abilities. These abilities, you're spending them on different elements that you want to enhance. These could be abilities like in terms of like increasing the abilities you already have, or getting new ones in the form of techniques. It could also be increasing your stats, increasing your teamwork, whatever the case may be. You're building up your characters, and it's very mathematical in nature, and in some cases you can make certain actions yield you better results. Like you can start to get AP from driving, you can start to get AP from fishing, you can start to get AP by racing chocobos or just riding them, and that sort of stuff is cool. And you could also do things like at one point I remember unlocking the ability to do like critical hits at close range. And the idea is like when you're unlocking these techniques, when you're unlocking these stat boosts, they cost different levels of AP. And the cool thing about the AP is there are different ways to accumulate that in battle, and you could wear different items to do it. There's a lot of different ways you can accrue AP and accrue experience. And as you're building up experience and if you're building up AP, you can unlock new abilities to increase those things, allowing you to do more. So there's a lot of math behind the scenes, right? And there's a lot of math at the forefront, right? Because behind the scenes, there's math that goes into the programming, math that goes into building the worlds and the story and how you progress, and the systems that are used to progress you. And on the surface, you're using a lot of math up front. You're using math as you navigate your missions, right? You're using them to build up your experience so you can level up. You are using them to gain ability points so you can do more. You're using them in terms of resource management because you're talking. You're you're using different items as you're progressing through the game, and you got to decide if you want to use them in certain situations, right? And also you're building up money as you go on throughout the game, and you got to decide how you want to spend that, right? And you got to decide when you're accruing items what you want to keep. And one of the cool things is they do separate the type of items when you go to the shops. So there are like sections that are like for different items that work for healing and recovering MP as well. So there's that sort of stuff. But there's also like treasure section where it's like most of the treasures are there specifically to be sold. So as you're finding them, the items in the wild, you can use those to make more money. If you find yourself with an excess of items, you can use that to make more money. It's all in how you want to play and what you think you'll need. I like to have a consistent flow of useful items. Like I was big on having like a bunch of high potions when I was able to afford them, as well as like ether. I held on to my mega elixirs unless I was dealing with like boss encounters and stuff like that. You got to decide what you want to do. And throughout the game, You got all this going on, and you're also dealing with things in real time. Although there is an option to switch back and forth between active versus waiting. But primarily, what you'll be doing in Final Fantasy 15 is dealing with the active cross system, where yes, it's real time, and you're doing things with that, but you can also sort of pause to use like an item and make that decision. Which is cool. And again, there is a waiting segment that if you switch to that, it allows you to scan your enemies better. Um, but I stuck to mostly the active side of things, and so all of that is really cool. And like it's Noctis, you can have different weapons, sure. I found myself mostly sticking with the sword because I found like a weapon like Ragnarok, and with Ragnarok, it's a regular sword, and it enhances your critical hits when you're doing warp strikes. And then there is also like an ability that I unlocked to like increase that further. So it's like I had the abilities and I had the weapon, and it's just like so I was dishing out some pretty devastating damage with that. But the other thing is you progress is like you realize that you're dealing with your health, you're dealing with your MP, and you're dealing with your stamina. All like have numerical representations in one form or another, or rather, they all represent something that's numerical in nature, whether you see the numbers or not, because you're dealing with gauges either way. In any of those cases. And so you got to keep track of that. But like over time, I found items and abilities that allowed me to not worry about stamina because that was just frustrating. But there are like so many different things you can do in terms of magic. You can actually get. Sorry, it works a little differently than it does in other games. Like the idea is like you can accumulate different flasks, and so you want to be careful about like what you're doing because you're working with a limited supply, right? And for the magic, you have fire, lightning, and blizzard, and or thunder if you prefer instead of the lightning. But the idea is, I, I'm good either way. But like you're drawing them from different draw points, kind of like in Final Fantasy VIII. And so you're drawing a certain amount, and you can like gain some abilities that allow you to draw more. But the idea is you're drawing a certain amount of those, and you then can do this thing called Elemancy, where you can like craft the spells, right? And based on the number that you have, you can change how powerful they're going to be. Like so, you can change the potency level. So if I have a certain amount of fire, then when I do Elemancy, I can craft like the second or third level for that, and the same with the other elements. Or I could actually use them all and create like a really super potent type of magic that is going to do one of those really, really well randomly. Um, or like if I remember that correctly. But either way, it was doing some devastating damage. And the other big thing, like in combat, is you do have the idea of summons. With the summons, some of them you do just like a crew, but some of them you absolutely have to battle in order to be able to use them. And unlike summons in a lot of other games, you can't just like use them willingly. Like in some other games, you might use a certain amount of MP to have the summons. Here, there are different conditions. So you might have the case where to use one summon, you have to be in battle and have survived that battle long enough for that summon to appear. In some other cases, you might have to be in danger. And you might have that your status is in danger, and you have to be like near water with the Leviathan. You might have something like Shiva, which is going to be kind of doing a combination of some of the things that I mentioned before. And like the other ones, you have like you have Titan, you have Rama, and some of their conditions I already mentioned, and then like you have Bahamut, and you can only really use him in one battle. There's Garuda, which you do unlock if you did this special mission that ties in together with Final Fantasy 14, which was really cool. Yeah, so but you have all these things and like more in this game. It's like really crazy. And then like outside of the regular everyday quests, you can take on some super bosses, and that's really cool. So you got to see what you want to do with that. Because I remember like the one that was the toughest to beat was probably Adamantoys. But it was, I guess, less difficult in the traditional sense and more just like it was a battle of attrition. So I had to survive and just continue to heal and do damage. There's probably some better way to handle that, but I did it. I beat that monster, and it was a super boss. And like the level was 99. I think like my characters were around like 85, but I figured out like pretty early on that like some of those characters can be like ahead of you, and you'll be fine if you do things strategically enough. And that's the other thing. Like you can figure out your enemy's level and compare that to your own. But yeah, so there's math in everything though that I said, and like I also said, there's math in the programming, there's math in the story, there's also math in the music, and how that was composed, how it comes to you, and how long it lasts, and all that good stuff, and how it makes you feel. There's also math in just sorry. There's math in some other elements too that were in my mind but were not coming out. Oh, here we go. There's math in the sound overall, in the mixing of everything, whether it be music or voices. There's math in the lighting as well. There's math all over the place in getting things to be the right level of this or right level of that. There's math in the strategies you use, and that's all really cool stuff. And with Final Fantasy 15, I could take this time to talk about my experience with it and what I thought about it. So with Final Fantasy 15, just also, yeah. So everything I said, there's math and all that, and there's even more stuff too, right? I just wanted to put that out there. But like back to my feelings. So here's the thing: I liked Final Fantasy 15. At points, I liked it a lot. At some other points, I didn't like it as much. So I kind of say it like this: it's a good game. I don't understand the people who hate it. But I can see why so many people like it like they do. Haven't played it. With that in mind, there were points where I was annoyed. I didn't like mission 6, I didn't like mission 13, and part of both of those lie in the idea that I feel like when you're exploring and you have the group and their dynamic, that was great, right? Because you have these like you have Noctis, you have Prompto, you have Gladio and Ignis, and they all have this cool like dynamic with each other. Like each person is doing their own thing, and it all works really well together. And I feel like when you're focusing on their friendship, that is great. When you're focusing on interacting with other characters, that's great. When you're focusing on the combat, that is largely great. But when they do things like they try to have things where like Noctis might have to like platform a bit more, they kind of stumble. They didn't perfect that. When Noctis has to do stealth, they didn't perfect that either. And both of those things were a problem. And then with Mission 13 in particular, it was a pacing issue. And, there's math and all this, which I think is cool, but despite my issues. So with that, it's an issue of patience for 13, because it's just like for me, it took hours to do that mission. It was frustrating, and Noctis didn't have all of the weapons that you've accrued up until that point. And here's the thing: I played a better version of that mission. I heard it was even worse when it originally came out. And so that's crazy to me. Like for reference, I got like the Royal Edition, and I got that on a sale, like on sale. So that was pretty cool. But yeah, so back to how I feel about it. Like I largely like the game, but it's not perfect. But I will also say that the ways that it's not perfect, despite them annoying me, did not stop my enjoyment of the game overall. And I also think it's worth noting that it does have a lot to give. And I think I didn't go over the history too much, and we're kind of so far into this, I can't get too much into it, but I do want to mention some small things. So I think Final Fantasy 15 existing at all is a bit of a miracle of like sorts because um, it started as a sequel to Final Fantasy 13. It was going to be Final Fantasy 13 versus 13. I forget at the immediate moment, but the idea is it was going to be a spin off of that, of Final Fantasy 13, and it was really slow in terms of development. Like after 6 years, they didn't get that much done. They were constantly getting into issues, and by the time they were getting somewhere with it, although not much. We had the next generation coming up, so they had to retool, and then that took some time. So by the time everything's said and done, it was 2016 when Final Fantasy 15 came out. So it took 10 years to develop this game, and they started in that like PS3, Xbox, 360 era, that particular gen, to the next gen. So that should tell you something where you had PS4 and Xbox, Wii U, and all that stuff. So yeah, it's just worth considering. Oh, in the previous generation, I meant to mention the Wii, but either way, so it's just like it's a small miracle that it existed because it could have just been done with. But it took 10 years to get to that game, and I think like overall, it paid off. Final Fantasy is a good game. I enjoyed it, but I will also say it's not perfect. But at the same time, it's not so flawed that I couldn't enjoy the rest of it. And by the way, if you haven't played it and you want to, I do recommend that. And just know that there's a certain point in the game where things will start popping off. Just know that. I'll see you in the next one. Professor Prime out.